Are you gonna send us back?
Not ever, not as long as I'm breathing.
Ma'am, are you sure about these two? Nobody else wants them. Ruth Calloway stood in the hallway of St. Agnes Children's Home, still in her crossing guard vest, $41 in her checking account, 6 weeks a widow. The caseworker held a folder stamped "Do Not Place." Behind her, two identical 8-year-old boys sat on a bench, neither one looking up. Every other child in that room had turned toward the door when it opened. These two hadn't moved. Why these two, Mrs. Calloway? You could have picked any child in this building. Ruth's voice came out quiet and certain. Because I know what it feels like when nobody turns around for you either. She didn't know it yet, but in 19 years, those two boys would stand on a street corner 3 blocks from that home and put her name on a building tall enough to see from the highway. All she knew was this. From today on, she would show up for them every single day, whether they ever showed anything back. 6 weeks earlier, Ruth sat in a folding chair in a church basement in Dayton, Ohio, holding a program with her husband's photograph printed in black and white. Walter had been a mail carrier for 26 years. He'd had a heart attack on his route in March, on a sidewalk 2 blocks from a house he delivered to for 2 decades. Ruth had worked the elementary school crossing on Fairview since she was 29, first because it fit around raising a family that never came, and later because the children on that corner had become the closest thing she had to one. She and Walter had tried for years. 3 losses, one at 19 weeks. After the third, the doctor had used the word incompetent, and Ruth had walked out of that office and never gone back to that particular hope again. She kept the vest. She kept the whistle. She kept showing up at 7:45 every morning, rain or shine, for children who belonged to somebody else. Ruth had worked that same corner on Fairview Avenue long enough to watch entire childhoods pass in front of her, one crosswalk at a time. She remembered a boy named Terrence who used to cross with his shoelaces untied every single morning until she finally knelt down one day and taught him to double knot them so they'd hold through recess. 15 years later, Terrence had come back to the neighborhood in a police uniform and stopped his patrol car just to tell her he still double-knotted his boots every morning because of her. She remembered a girl named Priya who cried at that corner nearly every day in 2nd grade because her parents were separating, and how Ruth had simply waited with her those extra few minutes each morning until the tears stopped, never asking for details, only offering her presence. Ruth had never once thought of these mornings as anything special. She thought of them only as the job. It would take her sons years to teach her that the job had never been small at all. The apartment felt different without Walter's shoes by the door. Ruth started sleeping with the television on for the sound of another voice in the house. She ate standing up at the counter because the table felt too large for one plate. At night she found herself doing the math she'd done 100 times before, the math of what her life would have looked like with a child in it, and for the first time in years she let herself finish the sentence instead of stopping it halfway. She was 52 years old. She had a pension coming, a paid-off Buick, and a spare room that had never been anything but a place to fold laundry. She had, she realized, exactly the kind of life nobody would call ideal for raising a child, and exactly the kind of life that had nothing left to lose in trying. She filled out the first inquiry form at her kitchen table on a Tuesday night, the same week she went back to the crossing corner for the first time since the funeral. Under reason for interest, she wrote that she had spent 23 years watching other people's children cross safely to the other side of the street, and she wanted, before she was too old to try, to be the one waiting on the other side for just 1 or 2 of her own. She did not put the word love anywhere on that form. She had learned a long time ago that love was a thing you proved with your hands, not a thing you wrote down for a stranger to grade. 3 miles from Ruth's apartment, in a converted rectory called St. Agnes Children's Home, twin brothers named Marcus and Daniel lay awake in twin beds after lights out. Their mother, Denise, had worked the loading dock at a distribution warehouse on the edge of town. She had died there when a pallet rack collapsed, a piece of equipment the company had been cited for twice in the 2 years before it happened. The company's insurer had settled with the state for an amount too small to make the news. No one had ever been held responsible in a way either boy could point to and understand. Their father had never been part of the picture at all. The maternal grandparents, when contacted, said they were too old and too far away to take on two boys at once. Marcus turned to the wall. Nobody's coming for us this time either. Daniel didn't answer, but across the gap between the two beds, his hand found his brother, and held on until they both fell asleep. At St. Agnes, staff had stopped introducing the twins to most prospective families months earlier. 3 couples had tried in the previous year and a half. Each one had lasted an average of 10 weeks before requesting a different placement. The boys did not cry. They did not ask for anything. They spoke almost entirely to each other in short sentences, and to adults only when a direct question required an answer they could not avoid. The staff psychologist had a term for it in his file, a flattened effect consistent with early relational trauma, and a note that both boys tested in the top 1% of children their age on every cognitive measure the facility was able to administer. Gifted and unreachable, the file said, in that order, as if the two things were meant to explain each other. Ruth arrived on a Saturday morning in October for what the caseworker called an observation visit, nothing more. The waiting room smelled like floor wax and old coffee. A woman named Mrs. Prout, the placement director, met her at the door with a folder already prepared, containing the profiles of 2 other children. The facility considered easier placements for a first-time single parent her age. Ruth listened politely, then asked if she could simply walk through the playroom and see all the children first. Mrs. Prout hesitated, then agreed. 14 children were in that room. 12 looked up when the door opened. 2 did not. Ruth's eyes went straight to the far corner, to a boy and a girl who were not a boy and a girl at all but 2 boys, identical, sitting shoulder to shoulder on a bench by the window, each reading a different book, neither one speaking. "Who are those 2?" Ruth asked. Mrs. Prout's expression tightened in a way that told Ruth everything before the woman said a word. "I really wouldn't recommend it," she said. "Not for a first placement. Tell me anyway." Mrs. Prout lowered her voice and explained what she knew: the warehouse accident, the settlement nobody could point to as justice, the grandparents who declined, the 3 families who had come and gone. "These 2 don't give affection back, Mrs. Calloway," she said. "They don't cry, they don't ask to be held, they don't say the things children usually say to make you feel like you're doing this right. Most people need to feel loved back. These 2 don't have it in them to give that. Not yet, maybe not for years. And in 54 days they age out of this facility's housing rules and get separated into 2 different long-term placements, because state guidelines don't allow twins past age 8 to share a room in transitional care." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, watching the 2 boys turn their pages within seconds of each other in perfect unspoken rhythm. Then she said the same thing she'd written on her form 3 weeks earlier. "I'd like to meet them." Mrs. Prout walked her across the room slowly, the way a person approaches something that might startle and run. "Marcus, Daniel, this is Mrs. Calloway. She'd like to say hello." Marcus looked up first, his face unreadable, assessing her the way a person assesses weather before deciding whether to bring a coat. Daniel looked up a beat later, more cautious. Ruth didn't crouch down with the bright, forced voice adults use on children they feel sorry for. She sat down on the floor across from them, so her eyes were level with theirs, and said simply, "Hello." Silence. Then Marcus spoke, flat and even. "What for?" Not rude, just a real question, the kind an engineer asks before agreeing to a project. "To find out what you 2 like," Ruth said. Daniel, still not looking at her directly, asked if she knew anything about structural load tolerances. Ruth almost laughed before she caught it. "No," she said, "but I know how to keep a car running on an Ohio winter with nothing but a space heater and a prayer. And I know how to stand on a street corner in the rain for 23 years so kids I've never met once get home safe. I don't know if that's worth as much as structural engineering, but it's got me through some hard mornings." The twins exchanged a look that lasted less than a second, and Mrs. Prout, who had watched these 2 boys for a year and a half, went still, because she had never once seen them agree silently about an adult before. Marcus tilted his head the smallest fraction. What kind of hard mornings? Ruth considered lying and decided against it. The kind where you bury your husband in March and come home to an apartment that's too quiet, and you go back to the same street corner the next Monday anyway because somewhere there are kids who need you to be there. Daniel looked at her directly for the first time. Did he die suddenly? Yes. Our mother died at work too, Daniel said. Nobody was ever punished for it. I know, Ruth said. I read a little about it before I came. Is that why you're here? No, Ruth said. I'm here because I drove past this building for 6 weeks trying to decide if I had anything left to offer anyone, and I decided the only way to find out was to stop driving past. The twins looked at each other again, longer this time, and something in the room shifted that Mrs. Prout would later describe to a colleague as the first crack she'd ever seen in either boy's foundation. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Back in her office, Mrs. Prout laid out the reality without softening it. Mrs. Calloway, you are 52, recently widowed, living alone on a school crossing guard's income and a modest pension. These 2 boys will require specialized behavioral therapy, ongoing psychological evaluation, and 10 times the patience most parents bring to one typical child, let alone 2 who have already broken 3 prior placements. I have a stack of applications from 2-income couples half your age who were also turned down for these boys. I can place you today with a child who will hug you within the hour. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Mrs. Prout finished, she asked one question. Did any of those 3 families ever give you a reason that wasn't about themselves? Mrs. Prout opened her mouth, closed it, and finally said no. Then those weren't families, Ruth said. Those were people looking for an easy feeling. I'm not looking for a feeling. I'm looking for my sons. Mrs. Prout studied her for a long moment, then pulled a thicker folder from her drawer and slid it across the desk. 54 days, she said. Home study, financial review, background check, 2 psychological evaluations for you as well as them, and a temporary placement period before anything is final. If you complete every single step in that window, they're yours. If you miss one requirement, even one, they go into the state system and you may never see them again. Ruth pulled the folder toward her without hesitation. Where do I sign? She said. The next 54 days were the hardest of Ruth's adult life, harder in a different way than losing Walter, because grief had only asked her to survive it while this asked her to prove something to strangers with a clipboard. She sold Walter's truck, the one she'd been keeping out of sentiment more than need, and used the money for 2 beds, 2 dressers, and new locks on a spare room door that had sat empty for 2 decades. She picked up extra hours doing weekend inventory at a hardware store to pad her income on paper. She borrowed $400 from her sister and didn't tell her sister what it was really for, because the caseworker had flagged her 1-bedroom apartment as too small for 3 people, and Ruth needed deposit money to break her lease and move somewhere with 2 bedrooms before the 54 days ran out. The home study visit came first, conducted by a caseworker named Mr. Braddock, who walked through Ruth's half-packed apartment with a clipboard and a voice that made every answer feel like a confession. How exactly do you intend to fund specialized therapy for 2 children on a crossing guard salary? He asked. I've already spoken to the school district's family services liaison, Ruth answered. They've agreed to a sliding scale referral, and my supervisor has agreed to adjust my hours around the boys' school schedule so I'm working while they're in class, not after. And if one of them has a medical crisis while you're at your post, then I leave my post, Mr. Braddock, because 23 years on that corner has taught me how to make a fast decision under pressure, and nobody has ever once accused me of freezing when a child needed me. Mr. Braddock wrote something down and said nothing. 2 weeks later, the letter came. Denied, citing insufficient financial stability for 2 children with documented special needs. Ruth did not sleep that night. In the morning, she filed an appeal in person, sitting in a county office waiting room through her entire lunch break rather than mailing the form and hopping. She asked her pastor to write a letter. She asked her supervisor at the school district to write one. A neighbor who had watched Ruth work that same corner for 2 decades wrote one without being asked, describing a woman who had walked 100 children safely across a dangerous street in every kind of weather for longer than most of those children had been alive. On the 52nd day, the appeal came back approved, conditional on a follow-up visit in 90 days. Ruth had 2 days left to spare. On day 54, Ruth drove back to St. Agnes with 2 small backpacks on the passenger seat where Walter's toolbox used to sit. Mrs. Prout met her at the door and shook her hand without a word this time. The twins were waiting in the entryway, each holding one item from their old life, a single spiral notebook apiece, nothing else. "Marcus and Daniel," Mrs. Prout said gently, "it's time." They stood. In the car, Ruth talked the entire drive about the 2 beds she'd bought, about the small garden plot behind the new building where she planned to grow tomatoes in the spring, about a dog she wasn't allowed to have yet but might consider someday if they earned it together. The twins said nothing the whole way, notebooks held flat against their chests like the last solid thing in the world. When they reached the new apartment, Ruth opened the door to the boys' room herself. 2 beds, 2 reading lamps, a shared bookshelf she'd built from a kid over 3 exhausted nights. Marcus walked in first, stopped at the bed nearest the window and touched the blanket carefully as if testing whether it might disappear if he pressed too hard. Then he turned around. "Ma'am, are you going to send us back?" Ruth's knees nearly buckled. She knelt down to his eye level the same way she had at St. Agnes. "My name is Ruth, and from today you can call me that or you can call me Mom, whichever feels true to you, but nobody is sending you anywhere. Not ever. Not while I'm still standing." Marcus didn't cry and didn't smile, but he didn't let go of that blanket for a long time. Daniel walked over and put his hand on the same corner of fabric, as if the two of them were checking together whether something soft was finally going to stay. The first weeks were quiet in a way Ruth had never experienced, even in the emptiest months after Walter's death. Marcus and Daniel moved through the apartment like careful houseguests. They made their beds without being asked. They washed their own plates. They answered every question with "yes ma'am" or "no ma'am," in voices so level they might have been reading from a script. Marcus called her ma'am for 3 weeks. Daniel called her ma'am for nearly 2 months. Ruth never corrected either of them. She simply kept showing up, the same way she had for 23 years on that corner, rain or shine, whether the children crossing ever waved back or not. She made breakfast every morning before her shift. She read aloud at bedtime even when neither boy reacted. She left their door cracked so they could see her shadow pass in the hallway at night, proof that someone was still awake and still there. The spiral notebooks went everywhere with them. Marcus kept his in his backpack at school. Daniel kept his under his pillow at night. They wrote in them every evening before lights out, heads bent low, voices barely above a whisper. Ruth noticed and never asked. One Saturday, Daniel left his notebook on the kitchen table by accident. Ruth picked it up, held it for a long moment, and set it back down without opening a single page. When her sister asked why later that week, Ruth said it was the only thing those boys owned that had survived everything else in their lives, and she wasn't going to be the next person who took something from them, even by accident, even out of curiosity. On Sunday afternoons, Ruth walked the boys to a small park 3 blocks from their new building, the same park she used to cut through on her way home from Walter's old mail route just to remember him. A bench near the fountain became their unofficial classroom. Ruth invented a game, pointing at strangers passing by and asking the boys to guess what they were feeling and why. "That man is frustrated. Watch his shoulders. That woman is tired but not sad. See how she smiles at the dog anyway." For the first 4 Sundays, the twins only watched and wrote in their notebooks, saying nothing. On the 5th Sunday, Marcus pointed at an elderly man feeding pigeons alone and said, "That one is lonely but choosing to be outside anyway, because being alone indoors is worse." "Why?" Ruth asked. Marcus thought about it. Because maybe somebody used to feed the pigeons with him, and now doing it alone is the closest he can get to them still being there. It was the first time either boy had offered a feeling instead of only nomming one, and Ruth had to look away toward the fountain for a moment so they wouldn't see her face. The first time either twin called her mom came 9 weeks after they moved in. Daniel woke with a fever of 103 in the middle of the night, and Marcus knocked on Ruth's door at 3 in the morning, his flat, even voice cracking for the first time she'd heard. "Mom, Daniel isn't okay." Ruth didn't pause to register the word. She was already moving, wrapping Daniel in a blanket, carrying him to the car, driving through empty streets to the emergency room with Marcus silent and rigid in the back seat. The doctor pulled her aside afterward and told her it was viral, nothing dangerous, and that she'd done exactly the right thing bringing him in so quickly. In the waiting room, Marcus sat beside her without a word for nearly an hour, and then slowly placed his small hand on top of hers. He didn't squeeze it. He didn't speak. He just left it there, and Ruth understood, sitting in those hard plastic chairs at 4 in the morning, that her sons had finally chosen her back. The apartment building where Ruth had moved the boys sat in a working-class neighborhood on the edge of Dayton, a 4-story brick walk-up where most tenants had lived for a decade or more and knew each other's footsteps in the hallway. When the twins moved in, certain looks started almost immediately. The boys were quiet in a way that made some adults uncomfortable. They didn't play in the courtyard with the other children. They carried books too advanced for their age and spoke to each other in a private shorthand nobody else could follow. On the second floor lived a woman named Carol Hensley, 66 years old, who had opinions about most things and shared them freely with anyone in earshot at the mailboxes or the laundry room. "She's raising 2 strange boys who came from who knows where," Carol told a neighbor within Ruth's hearing distance one afternoon. "Something must be wrong with children like that. Must run in the family somewhere." Ruth heard about most of these comments secondhand, from a downstairs neighbor named Dolores who felt Ruth deserved to know what was being said behind her back. Ruth never confronted Carol directly. She kept saying good morning first in the hallway. She rearranged the boys' Saturday routine so they rarely crossed paths with Carol alone. Some battles, Ruth had learned over a long life, you win simply by refusing to play them. But Marcus and Daniel were exactly the kind of children who noticed everything, and eventually they noticed this too. It happened on a Saturday morning while Ruth was working an early inventory shift at the hardware store. The boys, old enough now to be trusted alone for a few hours with a neighbor checking in, went downstairs to the mailboxes and found Carol's door cracked open, her voice carrying loudly through the gap as she talked on the phone to her sister. "I'm telling you, Linda, that woman thinks taking in 2 strange boys makes her some kind of saint. Something's wrong with children like that, cold as fish, both of them, probably from a mother who couldn't handle raising them herself either." Marcus went still. Daniel felt something neither boy had experienced clearly before in his 8 years of memory, a sharp and specific anger. Daniel pushed the door open. Carol spun around, phone still at her ear, her face flushing red. "What are you two doing outside my apartment?" Daniel's voice came out flat and precise, 8 years old but sounding 30. "Ma'am, I heard what you said. Our mother died in a workplace accident that was never properly investigated. That isn't a character flaw, that's a documented safety failure." Marcus stepped up beside his brother. "And regarding what you said about us being cold, that's an assumption based on limited observation, not evidence. You don't know us at all." Carol's mouth fell open, then closed into something harder. "Who taught 2 children to talk to a grown woman like that?" "Our mother taught us honesty," Daniel said. "Our mother," Carol repeated. "Our mother is Ruth Calloway," Marcus said, "and you don't get to talk about her the way you were talking about us." Carol stood up, 66 years old with a temper that hadn't softened with age, and raised her hand, more out of old habit than clear intention. At that exact moment, the elevator opened at the end of the hall, and Ruth stepped out still in her hardware store apron, exhausted from an early shift, and saw in less than a second her 2 sons standing in a neighbor's doorway with that neighbor's hand raised in the air. She crossed the distance in 4 fast strides and put her own body between Carol and the boys, arms out, shielding them completely. "Mrs. Hensley," she said, "you will not raise your hand to my children." Carol's hand was still up, caught now and embarrassed, and that embarrassment curdled into something uglier. She called down the hall for her husband, Gerald, who happened to be the building's longtime landlord. Gerald stepped out of his own apartment, listened to Carol's version of events for less than a minute, never asked the boys a single question, and told Ruth flatly that she and her sons had 30 days to vacate the building. "Don't bother calling anyone about this," Gerald added. "It's my word and my wife's word against a woman raising two strange kids nobody else wanted. Who do you think people believe?" Ruth stood very still, one hand resting on each boy's shoulder, and said only, "We'll be gone before your 30 days are up, Mr. Hensley, and we won't be looking back." She walked her sons upstairs, filled the bathtub, laid out their pajamas, and only once the water was running loud enough to cover the sound did she finally let her own shoulders shake in the kitchen alone. The twins did not sleep that night. They sat together on the floor of their room with the door cracked, listening to Ruth run water for far too long and clear her throat the way she did when she was trying to make her voice sound steady. When she finally came in to say good night, she was smiling, the same way she always was, and neither boy said anything about what they'd heard. But once her bedroom door closed down the hall, Daniel pulled his notebook from under his pillow, and Marcus took the pen. "Today someone tried to hurt our mother because of us," Marcus wrote in careful, deliberate print. "She didn't cry in front of us because she thought we wouldn't notice. We noticed. We will remember this. When we are old enough, no one will ever be allowed to raise a hand to her again, and no one will ever speak about her the way that woman did. We will build something where only good people are welcome." Daniel read it, nodded once, and signed his name beneath his brother. Ruth spent the next 30 days making calls between shifts, rejected by landlord after landlord, some citing units already rented, others simply going silent once she gave her name. She eventually found an apartment through a coworker's cousin, a Greek immigrant landlord named Mr. Pappas, whose late wife had once worked crossing guard shifts alongside Ruth decades earlier. He didn't ask many questions and didn't raise the deposit. The new building was smaller and quieter, and the first night there, Ruth fell asleep on the couch folding laundry before she'd finished unpacking a single box. The boys covered her with a blanket without being told to. Daniel opened his notebook once more before bed and wrote a single line beneath the earlier promise. "Mom won, but she paid too much to win. Next question, how do we make sure she never has to pay that price again?" When the twins were 10, a fourth-grade teacher named Mr. Dillard sent home a note complaining that Daniel corrected him twice during a science lesson and calling the behavior disrespectful and disruptive. Ruth sat across from Mr. Dillard at a parent conference that evening, the note between them on the table. "Mrs. Calloway, your son needs to learn his place in a classroom," Mr. Dillard said. Ruth asked what exactly Daniel had corrected. Mr. Dillard admitted, after some hedging, that Daniel had been right both times, once about the water cycle and once about a math error on the board. "Then the problem isn't respect," Ruth said quietly. "The problem is that a 10-year-old proved you wrong in front of his classmates and it embarrassed you. I'll ask my son to raise his hand and phrase things more gently next time, but I won't ask him to stop noticing when something is incorrect, and I won't have him punished for being honest." Mr. Dillard had no answer for that. Daniel, listening from the school hallway where Ruth had asked him to wait, later wrote in his notebook that night, "Mom stood up for the truth even when it would have been easier to just apologize for us. We will remember that too." That same year, the twins asked Ruth, for the first time since moving in, if they could get a dog. Ruth had always wanted one, but money had been too tight for years to consider it. She told them honestly that they'd need to earn part of the cost together as a family before she'd say yes. For 3 months, Marcus and Daniel took on small chores for neighbors, raking leaves, carrying groceries up the stairs for an elderly tenant, and split every dollar evenly into a jar on the kitchen counter. When they finally had enough, Ruth drove them to the county shelter, where they chose an older brown mutt nobody else wanted, mostly because, Daniel said, he reminded him of somebody who understood what it felt like to be looked over. They named him Scout. It was the first thing either boy had ever asked for outright, and Ruth cried quietly in the shelter parking lot afterward, grateful in a way she couldn't fully explain, that her sons had finally learned it was safe to want something and say so out loud. The years moved the way years move when a mother works double shifts and her sons are 3 grade levels ahead of their classmates by the time they reach middle school. Marcus won his regional science fair at 10, the state fair at 11, and placed nationally at 12. His prize money going quietly into a savings account Ruth didn't learn about until years later. Daniel entered his first mock trial competition at 11 and won the state championship at 12, becoming the youngest registered competitor in the district's history within 2 more years. When Ruth once asked Marcus what he was saving his prize money for, he looked up from his textbook, considered the question with unusual care, and said only, "For something Mom doesn't know about yet," before offering a small, real smile and returning to his work. Ruth smiled back and didn't push, the same way she'd learned never to push open a door those 2 boys hadn't opened themselves. When the twins were 14, Ruth collapsed at the hardware store during a weekend inventory shift, the result of exhaustion and a blood pressure crisis she had ignored for months rather than miss a single shift. A coworker called an ambulance, and by the time Marcus and Daniel arrived at the hospital, brought by a neighbor, Ruth was already stable, resting in a curtained bay with an IV in her arm. For the first time in 6 years, both boys cried openly, at the same moment in the same hallway, neither one trying to hide it from the other or from her. Marcus gripped her hand so hard the nurse gently asked him to loosen his hold. Daniel stood at the foot of the bed and said, in a voice stripped of all its usual precision, "You have to stop working so hard, Mom, please." Ruth, weak and half sedated, still managed a small smile. "I'm all right, baby. I've just been doing this a long time." That night back home, Daniel wrote a single line in his notebook that broke from his usual careful print into something shakier. "We almost lost her before we were ready. The clock just moved up. We work faster now." The spiral notebooks multiplied. By the time the twins were 13, there were 9 of them lined up on a closet shelf, each labeled in Daniel's small, exact handwriting by year, each one sealed shut with a rubber band, none ever opened in front of Ruth, none ever offered to her to read. She never asked. She had decided long ago, back when Daniel first left one on the kitchen table by accident, that whatever those boys were building inside those pages belonged entirely to them, and that her job was not to know the plan but to keep showing up for the 2 people building it. Still, some quiet part of her that she never examined too closely understood that her sons were constructing something together, page by page, year by year, and that whatever it turned out to be, she was somehow standing at the very center of it without having been told a single detail. When the twins were 16, 2 acceptance letters arrived on the same Thursday. A summer engineering research program at a well-regarded university offered Marcus a full scholarship. A pre-law honors institute offered Daniel the same. Ruth read both letters twice at the kitchen table, her hands shaking so hard the paper rattled against the wood. Marcus did something he had never done in 8 years of living under her roof. He walked around the table and hugged her, arms stiff and unsure of their own angles, but he didn't let go for a full 12 seconds. Daniel didn't hug her. He simply placed one hand on her shoulder and left it there, the same gesture from the hospital waiting room years earlier, a language the 2 of them had built together long before either boy learned to say the words out loud. 2 years later, full 4-year scholarships arrived from the same institutions, and this time both boys hugged her at once, and Ruth cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to since Walter's funeral. The twins left for college in late August, the campus cold and unfamiliar and a full state away. They called home every Sunday evening at 7, talking 20 or 30 minutes at first about classes and dining halls and roommates. By junior year, the calls had shortened to 10 minutes, filled with project deadlines and exam schedules and apologies for missing Thanksgiving. Ruth never complained. She told herself this was simply what growing up looked like, that this had always been the entire point of everything she'd fought for during those 54 days years earlier. But some Sunday nights, after hanging up, she sat alone on her couch and felt an old, familiar ache resurface, the particular loneliness of watching someone she loved get smaller and smaller through a window, the way she imagined a child might feel on a long bus ride away from everything they knew. She never told anyone. She simply made tea and went to bed, the way she always had. The twins graduated within 2 days of each other in May, and Ruth flew out for both ceremonies, crying harder at each one than either son did, which made Marcus laugh out loud for the first time in years, which in turn made Daniel almost laugh too, which made Ruth cry even harder still. At dinner that night in a small pizza restaurant near campus, the twins told her they were both moving back to Dayton to work on a small project together. "What kind of project?" Ruth asked. "You'll see soon," Mom, Marcus said, and Ruth let it go, the way she'd let go of 100 closed notebooks over the years. They moved back that fall, rented a small apartment together, and for 6 months did not invite Ruth to visit even once. She saw her sons for 90 minutes every Sunday evening, dinner and dishes and a quick goodbye, and every time she offered money or asked to see their new place, they smiled the same small, real smile and said only, "Almost ready, Mom." On a Saturday morning in October, 19 years almost to the week since that first hallway meeting at St. Agnes, Ruth's phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Mom, today, 11 a.m., wear the green dress. A car is coming. Don't ask questions, just trust us." Ruth put on the green dress, the one she'd worn to Walter's memorial luncheon years earlier, because it was still the nicest thing she owned, and looked in the mirror at a woman of 71, silver-haired now, hands still rough from decades of gripping a crossing guard stop sign in every kind of weather. The car arrived at 10:45 and drove her downtown, past the old hardware store where she'd once picked up weekend inventory shifts to fund an appeal, past the church basement where she'd sat holding Walter's memorial program all those years ago, and stopped finally on a quiet corner 3 blocks from where St. Agnes Children's Home had once stood before it closed for good 6 years earlier. 2 glass office buildings stood side by side on that corner, 6 stories each, both wrapped in dark fabric. A small crowd had gathered, perhaps 40 people, a few local reporters, and at the front, standing together in matching dark suits, were Marcus and Daniel waiting for her. Ruth stepped out of the car and Daniel took her right hand while Marcus took her left. Daniel leaned in close and asked quietly, "Mom, do you remember the bench by the fountain?" Ruth turned her head and saw, through the narrow gap between the 2 buildings, the small park 3 blocks away, the same fountain, the same bench, still standing exactly where it always had. Marcus said softly, "We picked this corner because the top floor windows of both buildings look straight down that gap at that exact bench. We decided that when we were 9 years old, sitting on the floor of our room after lights out." Ruth's knees nearly gave out beneath her. The twins each handed her a cord. "Pull, Mom," Daniel said. Ruth pulled the left cord first and the fabric dropped to reveal brushed steel letters 3 feet tall. Callaway Structural Group, founded by Marcus Calloway in honor of Ruth Calloway, the woman who taught us to read what people are feeling before they ever say a word. Ruth made a small sound and pressed her hand to her mouth. She pulled the right cord next. Callaway Legal Advocacy, founded by Daniel Calloway, dedicated to Ruth Calloway, who chose us when nobody else would. The small crowd applauded, but Ruth barely heard any of it. She turned to her sons, tears sliding down her face without a single sob behind them, the quiet kind of tears that come from an old wound finally being touched gently for the very first time in decades. "Why my name?" she asked. "Why not your own?" Daniel answered, and for the first time in 19 years as her son, his voice cracked in the middle of the sentence. "Because Calloway isn't the name we were born with, Mom," he said. "It's the name you gave us, and it's the only name either of us has ever wanted to carry forward." Marcus added, "Come inside, Mom. Come see your house." They led her first into Callaway Structural Group, past a glass and pale wood lobby lined with black and white photographs, not of celebrities or investors, but of quiet children with the same faraway look Marcus and Daniel had carried into St. Agnes 19 years earlier. Marcus stopped her in front of a glass case in the center of the room. "Mom, this is our first product. We call it the Fairview System, named for your old crossing corner. It teaches children in foster placements to recognize and name their own emotional responses before those responses harden into silence the way ours almost did. We ship it free to every group home and foster agency that requests it. 6,000 children reached this year alone." Daniel walked her next into Callaway Legal Advocacy, past the intake desk, and down a short hallway to a door with a small brass plaque reading Workplace Safety and Tenant Protection Division. "Mom," he said quietly, "this division represents families pushed out of their homes because of who they are, and workers whose deaths get quietly settled instead of properly investigated, the way our mother's death was handled all those years ago. We don't charge any of them a single dollar. We pulled the county property records on Gerald Hensley last year. He passed away 3 years ago. We didn't sue anyone over what happened in that hallway. We simply built the door he once slammed on us and made sure other families can walk through it now without ever being turned away." Ruth put her hand flat against the door frame and said nothing for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone very small. "Daniel, you were 8 years old." "I was 8, Mom," Daniel said. "And I remember every single thing." They took her up to the top floor last, where 9 spiral notebooks sat stacked in careful chronological order on Marcus's desk. Daniel opened the first one, the careful, uneven printing of an 8-year-old still visible on the first page. "When we grow up, we will find a way to make sure she never has to pay a price like this again." The fourth notebook held an early sketch of what would eventually become the Fairview System. The eighth held a business plan for the Legal Advocacy Division, already fully formed by the time its authors were 15. The ninth, from just 1 month earlier, read simply, "Opening day is in October. Mom wears the green dress. Don't tell her anything yet." Daniel slid a folder across the desk toward her. "Mom, 30% ownership in both companies, a permanent seat on each advisory board, a paid-off house 3 streets from here, deed already in your name, and a small community safety resource center on the east side that you can run yourself or leave entirely alone, however you'd like." Marcus leaned forward and said, "Mom, you don't have to do a single thing with any of it, but everything in these 2 buildings belongs to you." Daniel knelt down beside her chair, eye level, the exact same way Ruth had knelt for both of them 19 years earlier in a small rented apartment with a freshly painted spare room. "Mom," he said, "you're done working double shifts forever, starting today." Ruth's sister, the same woman who had quietly lent her $400 all those years ago without asking what it was for, stood near the back of the small crowd that morning, watching Ruth press a hand to her mouth in front of 2 buildings bearing her name. She had never told Ruth she still had the promissory note Ruth insisted on writing out by hand at the time. 3 sentences on a torn piece of notebook paper promising repayment within the year. She had kept it folded in a drawer for 19 years, not because she doubted her sister, but because she'd always suspected, somehow, that it would end up mattering more as a keepsake than as a debt. She never mentioned it that day. Some promises, she decided long ago, are better kept quiet and simply watched come true. 5 years later, Callaway Structural Group and Callaway Legal Advocacy operate in 11 cities across 3 states, and every single building carries the same small brass line near its entrance, "In honor of Ruth Calloway." On the anniversary of that first hallway meeting, Ruth walks to the bench by the fountain, the same one visible from both office towers, and watches a young mother nearby teaching her daughter to read strangers' faces on the path. A young man wearing a Callaway lanyard passes by, bumps her gently by accident, apologizes, and asks if she's all right, having no idea that the name stitched onto his own badge belongs to the quiet woman he just brushed past. She smiles at him. "I'm more than all right, son," she says. "You go on now." So let me ask you the same question Ruth Calloway's son spent 19 years trying to answer for her. Who chose you when nobody else did? Tell me their name in the comments below.